plenty of time to get through the day. Before we kick off the afternoon, so come and collect it. That might be a huge relief to someone in the room. Let's kick straight on by saying that I am enormously proud for Housing Trust, two amazing organisations committed to combating poverty, but she also chaired the really fantastic civil society futures inquiry, which has a huge amount of overlap with the work that we've been promoting around community power at NLGN. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you.
Thank you, Adam, and thank you all for coming back from your lunch. I hope you got fed. It was a bit of a battle. This is supposed to be the graveyard slot. I hope it won't be that for you. Meeting in this building is both an unusual place to talk about community power, but also the single most important place to talk about it, because it reminds us that every institution in this country was formed by the agitation and fury of communities wanting to see change. I'm enough of a historian to know a little bit about how the City of London was formed. It's not what it looks like now. The guildsmen and the tradesmen campaigned to have a place in which difficult, tricky conversations could happen. And you see the result of it today. But that's true also of the TUC, it's true of the NHS, it's true of the BBC, it's true of our most precious institutions. They were formed by the agitation, the anger, the determination for change that comes from communities. And for all of us who work in public service, whether in large charities, small charities, local government, the health service, the police, we are at all times and everywhere dependent upon communities. They don't depend on us. We could not do our job for a minute if it wasn't for the activity of people in communities, whether they're visiting their neighbours when they come home from hospital, making sure that a child who goes to school has already been to a mother and toddler group so they know how to behave. If it wasn't for the people raising the alarm off the old person's step, all of that action of civil society taking place in communities is what we depend upon. And far too often, in my experience, we talk about the community as if it is somehow dependent upon the state, as opposed to the state in all its many and very important forms being massively dependent on what happens in that community. The evidence is completely compelling. If you're a young person and you join a sports club or a drama society, you will do better in life. You will be a happier person. You will be less of a call on the state, and it's not, believe me, the sports or the drama or the singing that's done it. It's being part of something. Associational life matters. It's what makes us human. It's what civil society and community is all about. And if, in some appalling dystopia, we stopped having allotment societies and choirs and residents' associations and people visiting old ladies next door to them, we would be in a terribly parlous state. So many, many years ago, when I was a very green community worker, sent by a social services director in a London borough, which I will not name, but it was 40 years ago, so maybe I will one day, to go and set up some harebrained scheme on some housing estate. And the guy said to me, you know what? You think we're a resource for you to serve. And one of the top line findings from the Civil Society Futures Inquiry is that that dependence is an eternal truth. The state is dependent on what happens in communities, what happens in communities within civil society broadly. The second eternal truth, which we sometimes seem to forget, is that there is no bit of public service that is not about relationships. It's about dependency and it's about relationships. So we may have as many with your neighbour. So if that's the case, and we are in public service a resource for the community, it really matters to us, doesn't it? The communities we serve, the communities that support and enable us, are strong. And we don't know a huge amount about below the living wage. You are hardwiring poverty into your local economy. Don't come afterwards and say it's such a poor community. If you're paying women below the living wage, you are hardwiring poverty into that community. If in your cuts programme you decide, and I know exactly why you'll decide this, that you'll charge a bit more for the collection of mattresses and rubbishes in your community, don't be surprised if the poorer areas look pretty beleaguered quite soon. because people would chuck stuff out because they can't afford to have it collected. If you decide that you will license on your high street fast food, cheap alcohol, tattoo parlours, don't be surprised if people don't feel massively proud of where they live. Because what we do as institutions daily shapes what happens in those communities. If you, even in the privacy of your own council chamber, call some members of the community the usual suspects, you are not just using the language of the criminal courts, which you probably shouldn't about your community, but you are delegitimizing community representation and leadership. You are delegitimizing the people who take the really brave step of stepping up and wanting to do something. And if you run a funding regime that insists on conditions for receipt of £3,000 that you wouldn't apply on conditions of a contract for £300 million, and it happens, then you are doing something to that community which will produce a weaker, more beleaguered community. One of the things we did in the Civil Society Futures Inquiry was only ever meet in civil society spaces. I don't know if we'd have included this glorious space, but colleagues in the room who were on that inquiry with me will know we met in some pretty awful places. The institutions that pay for or don't pay for the damp, miserable community centres up and down this country are signalling to the community that where you get together, it doesn't really much matter. And it may be damp, and it may be chilly, and it may only be open on every other Wednesday, but that's okay for you. The decisions we make as institutions shape the communities on which we then depend entirely. So there are things we can do differently, and I'm going to argue there are things we need to do urgently and differently, because our times are changing fast. I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room about the challenges of the next decade. Our torn and desperate social fabric, with huge levels of insecurities, maybe changing slightly, but is at an all-time low, and that seems to be true of local leaders as well as national leaders. The huge changes to see that coming. I don't think we have taken into account the new power, the different power in some of the cities, those constitutional changes which will affect all of us, are taking place in our communities, where it is the community that is rallying to help people who are flooded and flooded again. When we know that the evidence is crystal clear, if your home is flooded, you are much, much more likely to have mental health problems within the next 5 years. And if it's flooded with internal sewage, which is happening all across South Yorkshire as we speak, you are almost certainly going to have a major crisis of some sort. We know this stuff. We know people are facing it. We know the community are the first line of response. And we know that our only real response to catastrophic climate change is engaged, resilient communities. So it sort of matters. If this is the future, where data can be going around the world at the press of a button, and of that incredible presentation from Helen about how we now communicate, there is a shadow side to that. And the shadow side is people being very afraid of their privacy and who holds their data and what they do with it. And a hugely positive side, which is how we can communicate and build lasting change. Now, I don't think local authorities, housing associations, police forces, universities, health authorities, and hospital trusts can get through this next decade without a really different approach to what's happening in communities. I said at the beginning, you couldn't do your job without them. Let's just look forward to what you will need your communities to do. Communities provide, in all their forms, I should have said this at the beginning, communities are messy, they're angry. As somebody said to me, a journalist right at the beginning of the Civil Society Futures Inquiry, it's not very civil. Well, of course it's not civil. Community organisations, voluntary organisations, residents' associations are formed out of anger, they're formed out of love, they're formed out of a passion for place. Of course they're not tidy. Of course they're not easy to deal with. Of course they don't come neatly packed with professional boundaries around them. But without them, you can't do your job, because it is community organisations and people working locally who know what's going on. The klaxon warning that you need to hear that something is going wrong will be heard by those communities who know what's happening. In this great city, the Grenfell Tower tragedy has rocked us all. The residents in Grenfell Tower were talking about the risks they faced. The people in the community around knew it. The horrors of the Windrush response by the Home Office and the way in which people were forced to leave, people in the communities knew it. The Home Office ended up losing the Home Secretary over it, but that knowledge was held in communities. Any big disaster that you want to think about, near where I live, the appalling child sexual exploitation cases that were going on have rocked so many local authorities. People in communities knew what was happening. They weren't being secret. We weren't listening. That's true of things that go wrong in our institutions. Just look at the Twitter feed of parents and children in NHS, some of the NHS treatment units. They're angry, they're not reasonable, they're furious. I'd be the same if it was my child. That's what's happening in our communities. People are finding ways to express themselves. It's deeply uncomfortable. Those communities are people who work for us. They're people within our organisations, they're people without. There is no boundary between whether you work in a hospital trust as a receptionist in the morning and you're an activist in your residents' association in the evening. We need the voices of the community to be heard. But we need the community for other things too. They can sound the alarm. They can shape the story. In Scotland, where I do a lot of work, it's a very live discussion about who tells the national story. But that's true in every place in which you operate. In every part of this kingdom, there is a discussion of what is the story of our place, what is our narrative, what is our identity. And I don't think that narrative or identity is created by a director of communications working in a local authority. I think they may be able to add a gloss to it. It's by listening intently to what matters to people, the stories they tell, the connections that exist, the ways in which people work with each other and connect, what families and their ancestors have done for generations, how people have changed and new people have come in, the food, the smell, the songs of a place are all held in the community and they are part of the identity. And what do we need more than anything at the moment is a strong sense of identity about place. So it's sounding the warning, it's shaping the story, it's connecting people in difficult times. We have some extraordinarily difficult decisions to make as a country, as a locality, as a neighbourhood. We all do. Where will the new housing be built? I don't want it built next to me. Well, we have a very tricky hospital for homeless and mentally ill people. I don't want it on my street. Those discussions are where the community can mediate, can bring people together. And it won't be easy and it won't be tidy and it won't be neat. But that's where change starts to happen. And that's where progress starts to happen. So mediating is the third thing. And of course, having new ideas. Is there any change that any of us can see in any of the services that we run that didn't start because somebody was really fed up? Now, they might have worked within your institution or they might have been outside. They might have been a really angry parent who was cross at the treatment of their child with autism. They might have been some of the greatest charities we have, the people who campaign to allow parents to stay with their children in hospital. These come from anger and they come from love. And unless we start observing that, where will we get our next ideas from? I don't think I've visited a major urban regeneration scheme in this country, and believe me, I've visited a number, where there wasn't at the heart of it a woman, frequently a mother or a grandmother, frequently someone extremely angry and difficult to deal with, who had said at some stage, this is simply not good enough. Now, around that came a massive programme of regeneration and KPIs and all sorts of boards and very large salaries, but the drive, the identification there, and how we learn the real skill set, which was listening intently. Because the most important changes in any locality are exciting things. Might be happening, as Helen described, with the 3% who are doing things differently. People working right at the edge of their autonomy somewhere, where they're doing stuff they really shouldn't do, but they get away with it. Or people who are using your services, whether they work for you or not, saying, do you know what, this really isn't good enough. This isn't working for us. Listening really acutely is what makes institutions stronger. Because what is leadership about? It's about deep humility and real curiosity. And it's the curiosity that allows you to see what's not working, what needs to change. Civil society has always been there and has always been at its best at points of change. My colleagues who work in the inquiry, displaced people came from the displaced persons camps across Europe and moved to this city. It was the time that dramatically traumatized soldiers came back into our communities. And what did you see? An explosion of new charitable forms, voluntary organisations, community activity. Fast forward into the 60s, and that explosion of identity politics and a sense of association created some of the strongest Black and minority ethnic organisations this country is privileged to have, for people who came together and said, you know what, we came here, but the way in which we're being treated for our housing, our employment is simply not good enough. They created the strikes in St Paul's in Bristol. They were part of the movement that created Notting Hill Housing Trust and drove out Rackman. Those big institutions in our lives came at points of change. And we are at another major point of change. There's debate about whether you should call it the fourth industrial revolution, but you all know what I mean. We really messed up the last industrial revolution. When we deindustrialised, we put swathes of men in Yorkshire and Lancashire and southern Scotland onto invalidity benefit. That was how we dealt with that transition. And we are living and reaping the consequences of that today. Anyone who works in those areas will know what damage was done to those communities. We are going into another period of huge transition. And if it's to be a just transition, a transition in which the poorest and weakest don't just go to the wall, in which we don't see more and more and more flooding of the poorest parts of this country, if we don't see people completely displaced and having jobs that are so insecure they're not worth calling a job, if we're not going to see that, we're going to have to start working differently. And Civil Society Futures argued that in this environment, in this really fast-changing environment, we haven't then come across fires in Australia and coronavirus everywhere else, but we did talk about the risks of climate change. We did talk about the risks of globalization. In this environment, civil society needs to be renewed, it needs to be re-energized, it needs to have its proper place. But that requires the institutions which we cherish and which are hugely important for this country. This is not saying that local authorities and the NHS have lost the way. It requires us to be connected much more deeply, much more profoundly than we have ever been before, because this is an emergency. And we are at our very best when things are changing so fast. If we don't do it, I don't think future generations will thank us for it. And the sort of building that we have here will not survive because we will lose the trust and respect that we need to have as we go into the next decade. Thank you very much.
So, not coming up on the screen, doesn't matter. I will ask them directly off my phone.
Look at you then.
Yes, look at me. Yes, there we go. So you mentioned in your talk about not dismissing the usual suspects, which is quite right. But the first question there, sometimes local representatives really are a small hardcore of people. Is that something we should be worrying about? How do we engage a bigger cross-section of the community?
Quite often there's a small hardcore of people and they're hoarding power. One of the things we talked about in the inquiry was the need to share power, very similar to the way that Helen did earlier. And people thought we were having a pop with the big household name charities. Well, we weren't. I've come across so many residents' associations where a group of people are hoarding the power to themselves and not allowing anyone, encouraging and enabling other people to form their own organisations. New generations will always have new ways of working, listening to them, engaging with them. And the risk, and I think I've probably said it myself, I've been the chief executive of a housing association, couldn't we just have one organisation, it'd be so much easier? Well, no. Community voices you hear. And actually what matters is recognising that new generations, new people will be organising in different ways. You need to give them the same respect.
Thank you. Here's a question. Yes, here's a question that you will definitely be able to answer. Does the voluntary sector need a shot of community power thinking as much as the public sector?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think you've got a better title than we did. We talked about a fundamental shift of power, which recognises where skills and knowledge are. And there are undoubtedly major household name voluntary organisations or major charities that are changing fast, but need to change fast too. For too long in the sector I've spent a lot of my life in, we have found ourselves looking to funders many of you in this room, to regulators, some of you in this room, rather than to our core accountability, which is the citizens we serve. And that's been a mistake. It's led us to attend more to brand than to service. It's led us to think things matter, the organisation matters more than what we're there to do. But I don't think this is a one-off, a smaller go. I spent some of my very early years putting mattresses on church floors for what turned out to be Women's Aid, now a really major institution. But actually, that was a really important bit of community activity, which is now an established organisation. Let's hope it stays that way, because we need a network of really decent refuges, but that's not where it started.
One of the, just follow-up question to that, because one of the things that we see happening in local government, and potentially the rest of the public sector, but certainly in local government, is to look at organisational culture and shifting culture as being the absolute driving force of being a successful organisation, but also being an organisation which can be led by the community rather than hierarchical and inward-facing. Is the same debate happening in the voluntary sector? And I ask that partly because there seem to be quite a few problems and issues recently with leadership in the some voluntary sector organisations.
I certainly wouldn't gloss over those problems. They have been desperate and dreadful, and we have to acknowledge them. I think culture change is not a destination. It's what you carry on doing. And I think one of the things we identified in the inquiry, which I don't think I'd expected to see, was the blurring of lines. It used to be, you worked in local government, you worked in the voluntary sector, you knew where you were, and you hated the others. Actually, most people in most organisations, not just in career terms, but in their personal lives, are moving backwards and forwards. You know, people take on trusteeships, as I said, you know, most people will be in their residents association and at the same time a middle manager somewhere. We've got to get recognising that fluidity, that knowledge, and that constellation of leadership that we have that doesn't always have leader as the title. It's to do with where knowledge is held. There is, you know, we are standing here, Adam and I, as leaders, because we're speaking to you from a platform. If that fire alarm goes, somebody else will be leading. I haven't got a clue what to do. And that's true in our institutional life too. There are moments when we are led, and there are moments when we lead. And that's what good culture and good cross-organisational working allows.
Final question, and this is a great question and something we're really thinking about very hard at the moment at NRGN. Can this shift ever be supported by national systems? I'm thinking here particularly of central government, rather than happening only despite those national systems?
I'm an eternal optimist. I don't think it would be led by national systems, but I think national systems can make it possible. I think, I looked at the list, I think you are mainly from England. Look above the border in Scotland where rather different messages are going out. It's still not where we want it to be, but it's different. It shapes the conversation differently, a different sense of who's listened to and who matters. Carolyn Wilkins, who's from Oldham, who was a member of the inquiry, has this amazing phrase, which I've heard so many times now, but I know it comes from her originally: what gets designed depends on who's in the room. And I think for too long, local government has looked to the central government for permission. I think it's better to crack on and do stuff and then look for approval. But I do think there are signs of some change, and there are some risks. I think the recent white paper is a worrying trend, and I think we have to show a better way of doing these things. And locally, we have power and we have authority. We don't always need to ask permission.
Well, thank you so much indeed. That was really, really interesting. So we are now going to go back into the community breakout sessions. As I said this morning, they're the same sessions running again. So choose another one you didn't go to, or if you really enjoyed the one you went to, go back to it again. I'm sure you'd be very welcome. Can everyone read where, because some of the locations have changed from the programme. I know that caused a bit of confusion this morning. Can everyone read what it says there? If not, come up close. They're in slightly different places than they were before. And then back in here at 10 to 3.